This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools and the Minnesota Historical Society. Today's show is about Minnesota's largest Amish settlement, which is near the small town of Harmony in Fillmore County. It's about an hour's drive southeast of Rochester. It turns out that the community is one of the most conservative of its kind in the country. Its first families came in the 1970s. This question came to us from David Campbell, who wondered why and when the Amish selected this sliver of southeast Minnesota to call home. Thanks so much to David for this great question. I'm here today with my colleague, Sean Baker. Sean, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Erica.
Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about what you do for the Minnesota Star Tribune.
Yeah, so I'm one of the Greater Minnesota reporters as part of the new Minnesota Star Tribune. I'm based out of Rochester. So that means covering everything down here in terms of Mayo's expansion, but I also cover what's known as the Driftless area, extending down from Winona to Lanesboro and some of the other Root River communities.
Got it. So before we get to the bottom of David's question, why don't you give us a quick overview of Amish history? Because I know you wrote in your article that they didn't arrive in Minnesota till the 70s, but there's a lot of history before that. What happened?
Yeah, so the origins of the Amish date back more than 3 centuries when a sect of Anabaptist Christians broke away from the Mennonites in Europe. They had some disagreements at the time about how to adapt to modern times. And that's a conflict that still plays out today among various Amish communities. So by the 18th century, the Amish had begun facing persecution in Europe. The main sticking point is that the Amish wait until adulthood to get baptized. So they started settling in mostly Pennsylvania, where about 100,000 Amish still live today, before settling in other parts of the Midwest, such as Indiana and Ohio.
Got it. What led them to seek out a home in Minnesota in the first place?
Well, a couple of the Amish folks I talked to in southern Minnesota told me that Ohio, where their families had lived, had become too crowded and started to feel like a city. And they couldn't preserve their way of life there. So by the 1970s, they started to migrate west.
And what do we know about how and why the first Amish families moved to the Harmony area in particular?
Abundant and affordable land is the quick answer. They could purchase farms here for as low as $300 an acre, much cheaper what they could find back home in Ohio. So by 1974, after 4 Amish men came out to survey the land, the first families began to make their way to the Harmony area.
Got it. And was there anything else about this part of Minnesota that was appealing to them?
Yeah, I mentioned the price, but the land itself was also a draw. The region is home to fertile soil and nearby natural springs, really making it an ideal place to start a farm where they could live off the land and sustain themselves for the most part.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting learning that because I grew up in Wisconsin, and I'm not Amish in any way, but they also found cheap land in the 1970s.
Yeah, there's actually more Amish in Wisconsin than there are in Minnesota. I think it's in the top 5 in the country in terms of Amish population, Wisconsin is.
Gotcha. So you were able to visit the Harmony area and go on a tour there while working on this Curious Minnesota story. What is it like there?
I was struck by how integrated the Amish have become with the rest of the region. You can see them walking down Main Street to a bank or even in the back seat of a pickup truck on their way to a construction job. And while they don't drive themselves, the men have become dependent on jobs outside of farm work to support their families. And they also have a number of businesses, furniture or bakeries along the road stand. So there's really more ways to interact with the Amish than I really would have thought.
Got it. And is the community near town or is it in the country a bit?
Well, they're all in the country, and they're spread out about 10 square miles, this specific community that includes about 6 church districts. There's about 800 people there now, and I've seen estimates as high as 1,000. It is the single largest community in the state with about, I mentioned, 6 church districts. There is another community on toward Iowa that's kind of broken away, and others in the north central part of the state.
Well, tell us a little bit about what you saw when you were there and some of the people that you talked to for this story.
Yeah, so we took a tour with Rich Bishop of Amish Tours of Harmony and stopped through a number of Amish businesses. Some were quite friendly, others were a little reserved. For a community that prides itself on having a uniform look with strict rules on dress and facial hair, it was interesting to see there was not just one way of being Amish. I spoke to a woman, a quilter, an older woman who has 88 grandchildren, and just the wryest sense of humor. And so you think when you see them from the outside, they look, all the same. But, as you get to really know the different folks that live down there, they all have different personalities. They're human. They all have different interests and ways of looking at the Amish life.
That makes sense. Are there ways that reporting in an Amish community is different from other places or people that you've visited as a reporter? I know you were saying with photography, folks don't want to have their photos taken.
Yeah, they don't like to be photographed. They consider it to be too public. But they did let us show us their hands or let us photograph their houses. One woman allowed us to do a full tour of her house and document it. And while many said they didn't pay too much attention to politics or things like that in the external world, they are tuned into what's happening more than you think they would be. And you might be surprised to know this, Erica, that the twins are a big deal in the Amish world. Kids routinely check the box scores in the paper, or even some will sneak a radio broadcast in.
That is so interesting. And I know that you talked with someone who is not in the community anymore and actually is a bit of a social media personality. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
So his name is Eddie Schwarzentrooper, and he left the Amish community about a decade ago. He's 28 now, married with a child. And he was able to share a little bit of insight of what it was like to grow up Amish. He talked about, while it wasn't for him, he still respects the Amish way of life. And it uses this social channel to clear up misconceptions or to answer things like, do the Amish drink beer? Some do in this older order community.
That sounds fascinating. Let's hear a little bit from Eddie here.
We had more fun than probably most kids, growing up. And we got in trouble a lot. But a lot of people also have the perception that a lot of Amish aren't happy. Most Amish that are living Amish are actually really happy. They like the lifestyle. Yeah, some of the rules nag them and bother them a little bit, but they'll put up with it for the lifestyle.
So you describe this community as Old Order Amish. Let's get into what that means after the break.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/TwinCities.
History doesn't only exist in the pages of a book. History exists all around us. You just have to dare to look. Listen to Minnesota Unraveled, a podcast from the Minnesota Historical Society. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, so what does Old Order Amish mean? Is the community near Harmony more strict than in other places?
Yeah, and I mentioned the story that some other Amish settlements have embraced things like e-bikes to get around, but the Amish in the Harmony area adhere to this old order way of life, meaning no electricity, no cars, no attending public school. The idea is by avoiding these extra things, they can have a closer relationship with God.
And have some of these rules changed over the years?
My oh my, have they. Yeah, I mentioned the men now get around pickup trucks to get to the job sites, but the big debate now is actually over solar panels. Some homes I saw had them, others didn't. They seem to draw a line, though, between using things like gas engines for home or business. So if the gas-powered tool or solar panel keeps the greenhouse growing where they sell their flowers, they sometimes will make an exception.
I hadn't thought about solar, but because you mentioned that there's no electricity, it's interesting that now there are more options.
Yeah, and they'll still plow the fields by horse. And when it comes to their home, they want to preserve that old order way of life. But they've accepted some of the realities of, doing business in the modern world. They'll use cell phones for work, but they'll keep them in a little outhouse-looking building across the street from their farmstead. And again, it just goes back to we want to preserve our way of life for our family at home, but accepting the reality that, in modern world, to find out where your next job is, you have to have a cell phone. So they find all these little nuances and ways around the rules. And, not everyone feels the same. And so they appear to be very homogenous from the outside. But as you get to talk to them, they have different interpretations of what is right and what is wrong. And it's really up to, I mentioned the 6 church districts that are on this Amish settlement in the Harmon area. They'll make their own rules up, and they're not tied to the rules in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, or north central Minnesota. It's really up to each individual community to set its own guidance.
That's so interesting. And I feel like a space outside to store your phone in seems like a good summer challenge. So what are some of the things that you learned about how non-Amish and Amish residents near Harmony interact with each other and get along?
Yeah, so I talked to John Torgrimson, a former newspaper editor in the area, and he said there were conflicts early. The Amish actually took a case to the state Supreme Court over the use of fluorescent orange triangular signs and won. The Amish had said they were too flashy and went against their religious beliefs. There were also concerns about them buying up land and just some overall misconceptions about who they were. But the Amish and non-Amish have largely learned to coexist, and they really do depend on each other, in terms of these tours and for bringing in visitors to purchase their goods.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's been quite a few decades now. Okay, so did you get any interesting feedback from readers or some intriguing comments after this Curious Minnesota story came out?
Yeah, so my parents-in-law and some of my neighbors still get the physical print newspaper, came up to me and were just peppering me with more questions. They wanted the story to be a little bit longer. They wanted to know the whole history. But I told themselves they'll have to just go down there, take a tour, and experience the Amish way of life themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good recommendation. What, for you, was the most interesting thing that you felt you learned working on this one?
The biggest thing is just, again, how integrated they are. I had no idea so many men were getting in these pickup trucks, going to construction jobs, then, cashing their check at a bank after. So for people that, really pride themselves on preserving a certain way of life, just the economic reality portion of it, I thought was fascinating. And actually, the day the story came out in the paper, and as I was fielding these questions from my neighbors, and I actually saw a construction crew of Amish men in the back seat rolling out of my neighborhood. They were doing a remodeling job at one of my neighbors' homes. It would just probably be so far outside of what they could believe that I had just published this story about the Amish. So if I went up to them and said, "Hey, in the newspaper today," it would just, I don't know if they would, fully get it. Just the sheer coincidence.
Yeah, that's interesting. And did you say that newspapers are okay?
They really stay in tune with their local newspaper reporting. So the hyper-local issues, they're not going to get weighed down what's happening in Washington for the most part. Some might, but they still stay in touch with what's happening in their community. And again, I mentioned, tracking the Twins games. I actually had one woman, Franny Miller, the woman that she has 88 grandchildren. She laughed when she told me about how her sons had been so invested in the Twins that one actually snuck away on a bus to go up to Minneapolis to catch a game.
That is fascinating. And I think we'll end on that note. Thanks so much for joining me, Sean.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Okay, well, that's it for today's show. You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. And thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. If you have some feedback or a question, we love questions, send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.